Welcome everybody. We'll get underway. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with My Security Media. Welcome to Beyond the Perimeter, a virtual session looking at enhancing access control. This is a recorded session. Q&A, please use the Q&A, and questions are very welcome, particularly when we bring the panel up and they give their introductions as well. Without further ado, I would like to acknowledge we're recording this in Sydney and give acknowledgement to our traditional owners. Being in Sydney, this is the Gadigal country where we now call Sydney. So we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And we do hope that we have our traditional owners in the audience with us today or watching the recorded session. This session is going to discuss how to shift your capabilities beyond baseline security by unifying the cloud to the endpoint as part of a holistic zero trust architecture strategy. You can shrink your attack surface drastically via enhanced access control, leveraging the latest integrations announced between Zscaler and CrowdStrike. And so we'll have Sekuro with us as well, and having a look at how these two platforms have announced their recent integrations. So without further ado, can I please have our panelists on screen? Hopefully they come up smoothly. And introducing Jason Trampevski, Field CTO with Sekuro, Mitch Kelly, Practice Build Consultant with Zscaler, and Sen Philip, Security Solutions Architect ANZ with CrowdStrike. Gents, thanks for joining us. Good.
Great to be here, Chris. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, maybe let's just go through each of your roles with your respective organisations. And then, Jason, I think you can introduce us to enhancing access control as the subject matter. But yeah, just your roles, each of you, if you can, please, and what that involves.
Yeah, no worries. Hey guys, my name is Jason Trampevski, Field CTO at Sekuro. I look after our technology strategy and vision in the company.
And Mitch?
Hey everyone, so Mitch Kelly, Practice Build Consultant. So I help translate our solutions into offerings that help our partners like Sekuro take them to market and offer secure outcomes for their clients.
And Sen?
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sen Philip. I'm a Solution Architect at CrowdStrike, based out of Sydney. I work very closely with partners such as Sekuro and also with technology vendors like Zscaler. Pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Well, Jason, introduce us to enhancing access control. It's a broad topic specifically, and given the current climate, an incredibly important one. But yeah, talk us through exactly what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, sure, Chris, no problem at all. So today we're going to be talking around like moving beyond the perimeter and how we enhance access controls. So what that really means is historically we've been confined to our four walls. Our users and data have been inside our four walls, but now moving forward, our data is everywhere, our users are everywhere. So we need to apply more context, and then we need to look at other security controls and methods on how to improve our security posture. Key ones being identity and also enhancing access controls. So, we must protect beyond using username, passwords, MFA, and we'll go through some examples today as well. So a little bit of a pre-warning. I am going to be talking around zero trust, which is a naughty word for some people. Is it an overused marketing term? If you look it up on Google, you'll get a whole bunch of results. And when I looked up zero trust on Google, this is an example of what I got. A nice architecture diagram of a whole bunch of solutions and products, but it wasn't really explaining how does that help me increase my security posture? How do I get started on zero trust? And the more I looked at this diagram, it started to look like this, just a pile of spaghetti. And really, I think what the market and vendors and more are trying to do is actually just to make the complex look simple. But in actual fact, because it's so far from the truth, it's actually making everything really confusing and difficult to understand. So in terms of where do we start? We actually need to start everywhere. If you take a holistic approach to zero trust, because it is a large, if you take a holistic approach to zero trust, it is a large architecture, and it all starts with the human element, the people. Creating a cultural awareness of risk, what people do in the event of an incident, is really, really key. And then as we move along across identities, endpoints, networks, infrastructure, apps, Zero Trust is about protecting your data. So am I protecting my customer data? Am I protecting my staff data? Who's got access to that data? And then on top of that, tying in analytics and really getting some insights into what is going on, with inside the environment. So how do I align? What do I need to align with? We need to, and from here, we need to align some guiding principles. So always verify, am I who I say I am? Only give me access to what I need. Then if I've got access to something, make sure I've only got access to that environment and not to move outside of that environment. Whether I'm working from home or working from in the office, I should have the same security anywhere. As I mentioned previously, applying that analytics and really understanding and having actionable insights into what is going on within my environment. And then lastly, making sure the solutions and the architecture and framework is moving with the business, because the business is moving to cloud on their transformation journey. So we need to keep up with that pace as well. So how do I do it with some real world examples? I'm now going to go over two use cases, and I will hand over to Mitch. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. So I guess before we jump into this, it's probably worth highlighting who Zscaler is and what we actually do. So if you were to jump on our website, we've got to have an umbrella term where we can describe what we do in a single sentence. So that would be that we help our customers accelerate their digital transformation journeys. Now, if I was to expand on that, so it actually gives you a little bit of clarity, we provide a cloud-based connectivity platform that's based on Zero Trust principles. And this platform allows our customers to connect to the internet, software as a service or SaaS, and private apps securely. So the first use case, we're going to talk about how we can connect our users within our organization to cloud applications. Okay, so with use case one, you'll see we've got a few elements here on the screen. So we've got our endpoint, so we have to have somebody who's actually connecting, right? That makes sense. We've got the internet, so this is obviously an internet-based cloud application. And so our endpoint's going to navigate to this cloud-based application. And what we would typically do, the first line of defense that we'd have is having an authentication screen. So we require authentication. And if we're being good citizens, we'll also have multi-factor authentication enabled, as we've got up there. Okay, so the next thing that happens, after this is okay, and we've got that trademarked, we're probably going to say that a fair bit today, there's nothing wrong with this. All right, so there's nothing wrong with this whatsoever, but there are more secure ways to have this particular setup. So let's have a look at how we could actually reimagine this using a joint Zscaler and CrowdStrike solution to provide secure end-to-end connectivity to that app. So we've got our endpoint again there, and you'll notice as well that we've got the CrowdStrike Falcon logo. So it's got the CrowdStrike agent loaded on there, and also on there is the Zscaler agent. We call that Zscaler Client Connector. So we've got the CrowdStrike agent looking after the endpoint, Zscaler Client Connector providing secure connectivity to Zscaler's cloud-based platform on the internet. So the user tries to seamlessly access this application. So they type in the application name, in their browser and hit enter. Okay, now the first thing that's going to happen once they try and access that application is they should have an identity check from Zscaler. So how this actually works is Zscaler, you need to authenticate with the client. So we actually ensure you are who you say you are. And once we've authenticated with the client's actually able to do additional checks on the endpoint itself. So the next thing that we do is we're going to check the posture of that endpoint. And with that, it might be things like, we can check for whether you've got all the correct updates on that operating system. In this case, we're checking that you've got the CrowdStrike agent installed on that endpoint. And you'll see a score there, a score of 91. So the CrowdStrike platform is able to produce a zero trust assessment score. So this score verifies a number of different factors that contribute to that endpoint security posture. And Zscaler is able to ingest this score so that we can actually assess ourselves in addition to the other policies that this particular organization has set. So essentially, we're going to get a pass-fail from here. So in this case, it's green. So they might have set a particular condition like anything with a score over 80 is cool. Okay, so our score is good. We've got the agent installed. we're connected to the Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange. Now we're forwarded to the application where we can complete additional authentication and ultimately gain access. So it seems like a pretty simple flow, but we've actually gone through and ticked off a number of those zero trust principles that Jason's talked about. And with the most important one being that we verify the identity, we verify that we've got some element of security posture, and we've also got the ability to inspect and get visibility of that traffic from the endpoint to the application. Thanks, Jason. So if we look at this, this is better. So we've definitely added some additional elements here. And with this, we're able to actually protect our cloud applications. So by requiring connectivity to come from Zscaler, then we cut out a lot of those nefarious elements that could potentially access this application. We've got the potential to reduce our attack surface as well by restricting who can actually connect to this application to begin with. By requiring a robust identity, we actually prevent credential stuffing attacks. So it's very, very difficult to try and rotate through a huge number of credentials with this particular architecture. It does help prevent the account compromise, again, with those robust identity checks. And ultimately, even if we do have a user or somebody who's actually been able to enumerate or steal credentials, that endpoint itself, we also check the posture to ensure that it's not compromised in and of itself and might have malware.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. So here's an example of two, Zscaler and CrowdStrike working together on how to increase their security posture, on how to increase a security posture of an organization, just connecting users to Cloud App. So really simple use case. We'll move on to use case number 2, and I'll now hand over to Sen. Thanks, Sen.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Mitch, for covering that first use case. Again, this is a solid partnership that we have with Zscaler here, amazing integrations. And the second integration works with Zscaler's private access, so what we call ZPA, right? So you're trying to access those applications in those data centers. So we dive a little bit more deeper. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so let's look at what happens now, right? Traditionally, endpoints connect to the internet. You've got a VPN. Once you're in that virtual private network, you're in a trusted network, which means any applications that reside within the trusted network, you can access, right? And this is what most companies do, but again, there's a better way to do this. So let's look at what that better way is. Now, Mitch talked about the endpoint and there's a couple of things that get installed on that endpoint. One is the Zscaler agent itself, but then there's also the CrowdStrike agent that gets installed on that endpoint. Now, from a CrowdStrike perspective, what we are trying to do here is to give you guys a ZTA score or a Zero Trust Assessment score. That score is calculated on a couple of things. First, it checks to see if the traditional or the native operating system security options are enabled. Things like, for example, on Windows, is Credential Guard enabled, is Secure Kernel enabled, is script monitoring and encryption enabled. If those native operating system security settings are enabled, we give it a higher score. Second thing CrowdStrike checks is, if the Falcon sensor is installed, how well is it installed? Because sometimes you could just put it in detect-only mode, which means we don't have any prevention or protection capabilities. However, if the customer goes in and ticks all the toggles and puts it in its full prevention capabilities, then you get a higher score, right? So that's ensuring that the source or that endpoint is protected and it's got a higher score. Next thing, the user tries to access that application, goes to the Zero Trust Exchange. The identity provider comes into play to see, does that user have permissions to access the resources? If not, Zscaler will block them. However, if they do, that's when Zscaler goes in and checks what does the ZTA score on that CrowdStrike system look like. This is a dynamic score. So we are continuously evaluating the endpoint, and we will change that score to see what is the current posture of that endpoint. So if it's high, like 90 in this particular case, then the customer might say, that's okay, you can go in and access that application residing in that data center. So once that check is done, you're also verifying if you're authorized to access that application. And the next thing here is with Zscaler's solution or ZPA solution, there's an internal connector that connects out to the user. So this is, again, more security, right? It's not going straight to the data center and accessing every application. It's that connector connecting back to the user, giving the user the right access to that application. And that's a better way of doing things with CrowdStrike and Zscaler. So again, we're trying to protect the specific application that the user is trying to access, prevent any sort of lateral movement once they get into that network, and also, removing the need for those VPN gateways and reducing the attack surface.
Awesome, thanks, Sen. Again, another really simple way on how we connect users to private applications and how it and also how it doesn't need to be complicated. In terms of some three takeaways or three tips that we'd like to leave you with is just tip number one: connect the dots. Make sure that you're leveraging all the out-of-the-box capabilities that your technology solutions have. That might be via API integrations and connectors, and just make sure that they're working for you. Number two, create actionable insights. I mentioned this previously. It's all well and good to make nice, pretty pictures and dashboards. Just make sure that they have purpose and that they're tailored to a specific individual or team. And then lastly, you need to look at what you can do, what you can't do. Whether that would be zero trust or personal life, it wouldn't matter. Having done, I meet with a lot of organizations that say we can't do zero trust, it's too complicated. Even doing 50% of zero trust and then even doing 50% of zero trust is better than doing 0% of zero trust. Now, with that, I would like to pass over to Chris. Hopefully that was useful, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. That was very good. One of my first questions came to mind exactly in terms of those three tips was the configuration process to make sure that this all works, and particularly onboarding the endpoints as well. Jason, how are you dealing with the clients, and what are some of the pain points around either deployment or the configuration? The misperceptions, I suppose, on how difficult this is. What are you hearing from customers? Yeah, sure.
I think a lot of customers aren't aware that all of this is available and how to turn it on or how easy it is to turn on. Having a broad knowledge of just cybersecurity technology solutions and what we work with, we can really paint a picture for the customer and then understand holistically how we're trying to help them, what the customer's trying to achieve, and then help them turn that on inside those portals. A misconception in a broad aspect would just be around zero trust is a marketing buzzword. It's not useful. When you look into zero trust and apply zero trust principles and really understand the underlying architecture, it can provide real benefits of either historically you had to pick whether you increased your security posture, however made users unhappy, or made users unhappy and then had accepted risk. But now you don't have to choose, you can actually choose both.
That's a fair point, maybe to Mitch and Sen, but Mitch, user happiness and convenience is still there. What's potential impacts there?
So I think if we were to look at sort of the pain point that we see a lot of our customers having, if I saw a common theme across everybody that we deal with, it's generally they're going to be looking at reducing their management overheads when they're associated with their traditional hardware-based security architecture. And the good thing is that we can not only provide the same or better experience, but we can also simplify a lot of what they're doing. So a lot of our customers either have a ton of point solutions or a ton of hardware appliances or a combination of the two. And so Zscaler solves for this by abstracting security to a cloud-based solution with a single vendor. So this reduces the reliance on that dedicated hardware infrastructure. And I guess if you think of it in simple terms, we move the appliance to the other end of the cable, with the other end of the cable being in the internet. So now point solutions are bloody fantastic at what they do, I have to say, and speaking generally, right? So they address a specific requirement and they do it very well. But adding best of breed solutions for every single use case in your environment generally requires, a ton of expertise to operate and manage, when most customers find that they either don't need or they can't support that level of complexity. So it's really providing a solution that steps it down a little bit in terms of the complexity while ticking all the boxes at the same time.
And Sen, likewise with you in terms of what you hear from customers, and just for the audience, welcome your questions now. Anything you want to poke and prod with these three gents in terms of each of these platforms and what their roles are. But yeah, Sen, what are you hearing from customers in terms of either misperceptions or is this just for large organizations, or can any organization fit this in?
Yeah, any organization can, it fits that criteria, right? I mean, it's easy to integrate, to set up. You go into the Zscaler portal, you get access to CrowdStrike API keys and secrets, you plug it in there. And once the scopes have been set up, customers can get visibility from Zscaler into what the CrowdStrike host looks like, right? And that integration is not just for Zscaler, but when we think about it, the industry right now, many customers have got multiple security controls, right? One for email, one for web, VPN, endpoint. A good security company allows those APIs to flourish, to exist, to integrate with those different solutions so that customers can get an overall benefit. They're not point solutions. They work together. They either share intelligence. And one of the other things that we do very well with Zscaler is Zscaler, a customer can go in and contain a host system in a CrowdStrike, right? So if they find something malicious happen on an endpoint perspective, they can just hit the contain button. And now that endpoint is contained as well. Going back to the topic on hardware as well too, most of the cloud native solutions don't really need hardware. Easy to set up, easy to control, and get visibility into those assets.
Well, Joshua has asked a question here. 50% is better than nothing, but how do you measure zero trust? I mean, you guys are using scores, right? So you obviously don't need 100% or a score of 100 to get through. You can, depending on what the application is, you can adjust that score. But yeah, is 50% better than nothing?
Yeah, I could take that. Good question, by the way, Josh. So in terms of how you measure, so if we go back to the 8 pillars I was talking around people, identity, endpoint, network apps, etc. Within that, you would need to establish where you are along your maturity. So let's just hypothetically say you got level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1 might be just starting, level 2 might be intermediate, level 3 advanced. Looking at potentially something like a level 2 might be applying MFA and enabling SSO, but level 3 might be like adaptive MFA. That's kind of how I would measure maybe a 50% or a 25% versus doing the full 100%, because it might not be realistic for your organization as well. And it just needs to be tailored to what your accepted risks are. Hopefully that answers the question. I don't know if the guys want to add anything there.
Yeah, I'll add to it. You can set your score depending on what you're trying to access, right? If it's a critical application that's got proprietary data, set it up to a higher score and then give access. If it's something a bit easier, lower, then you can just lower your access controls. And so it's flexible is what I'm trying to get to. You can define it from 0 to 100 and decide what user is trying to access what application, and based on the criticality of that application, set your scores.
Joshua is aligning this to Essential 8 as well. How does this sort of measure against Essential 8? Jason?
Yeah, I could take that. Another good question. Throwing a little bit of the harder ones today. The Essential 8's interesting. I've actually was talking about this with a colleague yesterday. You know, when we look at Essential 8 and then you look at things like enabling like macro office, I think like security settings to like restrict all office macros as an example, right? Probably unrealistic to do that when, if you look at organizations that use Excel and Office and whatnot, there's a whole bunch of macros that people are using. Turning them off completely or enabling strict controls around them is really complicated. It can actually cause more disruption than it would be good. Looking at potentially, as an example, an EDR solution like CrowdStrike, understanding what macros are being executed and then choosing what to block and not want to block would be a cleaner way of doing that and still aligning to Essential 8. Hopefully that example has answered your question.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well too. I mean, Well, what's interesting with that macro scenario, Jason, is, and maybe many of you know this, but Microsoft tried to come out with a mandate saying that they were going to remove macros at one stage, right? Disable macros. And then 3 weeks later, they came back and said, we can't do that. We'll need to enable it back again, right? So completely removing macros is going to be a challenge for many organizations as they rely on that. Think about security. I mean, with macros, without macros, if you've got a good security control, it doesn't matter because it's looking at what executions happen from that macro perspective, and we can stop attacks because operating systems may change and things might evolve, but if you've got good security controls in place, I think that's a better thing to think about than worrying about macros and other elements.
Yeah, and I think as part of that better together story, you might have an organizational policy that says no macro enabled documents whatsoever in the network or in this part of the network or with these particular endpoints. And so being able to halt the ingress of those types of files coming into the environment as well. So Zscaler can say block that at the network level, but as part of your security onion as well, even if something was to get through or it's obfuscated in some way that it evades detection, again, going down to having an endpoint agent that's able to detect what it's actually trying to execute and having controls there. So it's important to have both levels and both layers working in unison.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question here on the recent breaches. And we don't know enough about those recent breaches to kind of make comment on exactly what's happening. But yeah, I suppose ZTA is, it's not a new term, it's definitely overused. But how much significant risk is reduced when you have a strong posture based around ZTA, and exactly what we're talking about, particularly with cloud-based apps, to be able to control access. That's why we call this enhanced access control, because it allows you to, based on user or apps and what data is being used. But yeah, how much risk is reduced through ZTA?
Yeah, I can start if you want. I saw you. Until they announce exactly what happened, we're obviously all like speculating, right? And then it would be unwise to say that if you bought this or used this, that you would have been protected, because it's not a silver bullet. Introducing multiple layers of defense using zero trust principles and architecture is important. For example, one of the breaches potentially may have been via a compromised credential that was an old user. The user has left the company and their credentials have been harvested. In a zero trust architecture and in a zero trust architecture and using their principles, you would have configured the joiners, movers, and leavers, I guess like workflow policy, to make sure that if someone has left the business, they have their access removed. That would be one example on how to restrict that, but it's too hard to say that any part of that would have, I guess I would have like prevented anything, because depending on how well people are, depending if it's like a state attack or not, they will always try and look for a way of a path of least resistance.
So this is definitely making it more difficult for anyone coming through. The other one we had was common complaints or misconceptions heard in the market around ZTA. Do you think it's been overused in terms of a term, but not enough deep dives like this in terms of understanding the step-by-step process? It's always referred to as a journey, but access control is a key aspect around that verification.
Yeah, I mean, if I look at the way that the conversation has changed in the last few years, I think everyone jumped on the literal words zero trust. And so you hear people say, how can you have zero trust? You have to trust something, etc. And I think that's the problem, where a lot of vendors are able to run away and kind of create their own definition. So if we've got a definition out there, we need to have some solid backing behind it around what it does. And we've got some great publications like NIST 800-207, which outlines a really nice framework for zero trust and how to implement that in a given organization and network. So that's a great theoretical model there that also has practical aspects. But at the end of the day, if we look at it today in its very definition, it's just a misnomer like the rest of the words we see out there. Sandbox, there's no kind of sand in there, is there? Firewall, stolen from the building industry, never seen a fire, or hopefully not in a data center. So zero trust is just another one of those words where we need to get away from the literal meaning and have a look at the solid principles behind it.
Yeah, well, then that's what it is really, is a set of principles. What are the key questions? You talked about vendors and how they come to the market. What are some of the key questions that end users or CISOs and the like should be asking of vendors for that, again, the verification of what their credentials are?
Yeah, I think when looking for solutions, I would say there's a few questions that you can ask, right? First, when evaluating solution, is it effective? Is it going to do what it's supposed to do, right? That could be web security, or that could be endpoint protection. I would urge customers to do a proof of value, look at specific use cases that map to their environment, their hosts, their applications, their staff, and skills that they have in order to manage that solution, right? The second thing I would think about is what's the ongoing cost of managing that once they've gone past the POV, because sometimes you could get a nice flashy quote that says it's going to be this, but over the course of 3 years, it could look different, right? What does it look like in terms of updating the hardware, the sensors, the policies, the configuration, management, SLAs? I believe they all come into the equation as well when looking at solutions. Something else I also would encourage customers to ask is, how can the vendor help them with existing investments? So let's say they purchased web security or endpoint protection, and they're looking to boost their zero trust journey. Can those existing investments help them in any way, shape, or form, right? What can it do? And many vendors are also doing acquisitions. They're buying other companies. They're buying different modules and solution sets. For an existing customer, is that going to help them in the long term? How does it align to their strategy? A simple question you can ask is, what does that roadmap look like for me as a customer in a year or 2 years? How are you going to help me with other areas that I'm looking forward to enhance?
Jason, can you have a look at this latest one from Max? The balance and access control is always there because you don't want to make it too difficult for users, or they'll find their own way to circumvent their own access control as well. Yeah, how do you find that balance? And as the CTO, you're obviously looking at that from a risk-based approach, but as Sen mentioned, the customer's got to look for these solutions based on what their own environment is that matches. How do you find that balance between the current environment, the vendor community, and also the risk and what the business actually requires?
Yeah, no, sorry, I'm just still reading that question. I think, yeah, as I mentioned before, applying zero trust principles, because historically that when like security engineers implemented solutions and policies and whatnot, usually made the users upset because they were like, oh, I can't do this the way I'm going to, I can't keep doing the way I was doing it. I'm just going to find a workaround. You're going to block Dropbox access? I'll just tether to my phone and then I'll just do it that way. So they're just going to try and work around it. I think my advice would be, when you're starting on the zero trust journey, would be to get everyone involved as early as possible, explaining why the benefits. You don't have to call it zero trust. It can be called anything. But having those principles in your mind would be key. But yeah, I think communicating, here's the reason why we're doing it, as you've seen of recent events and past events, and protecting our brand and our customers' data is so important. And here are the reasons why we're doing that. Yeah.
Wonderful.
I think as well, if I could add, Chris, there's a lot of top-down decisions that happen with security, and I guess that's the whole thing of policy. We implement a policy and we enforce it downwards. But rarely do we get feedback on the effectiveness of that from the bottom up. And so look at things like password complexity. And if you have an overly difficult password complexity policy, people get frustrated and they'll create a password and just add numbers to the end of it. You see that time and time again. So getting feedback as well from the users and from your staff on how effective those controls are for them. You know, is this something that's causing overheads? Maybe we can look at a different way to implement it.
Wonderful. Well, look, you're welcome to ask more questions. We've got another one from Josh. How do we have a zero trust risk assessment? It happens when you need to share your data with a third party that isn't so vigilant. The supply chain, how does this sort of fit in within a supply chain, Jason?
Yeah, good question. This is a little bit more complicated because you're essentially trusting that, because you're not doing like an actual assessment on their environment. You're going through sort of a questionnaire type scenario, say, do you have this in place? Do you have this in place? And you're kind of putting trust in them to say, yes, we do. But I don't know what needs to change in terms of working with outside vendors, contractors, with third parties in terms of like, I don't know if it's holding them account. I don't know if holding accountable is the correct word, but there's got to be a better way. So I still think this is a problem. There has to be a better way of when we work with outside organizations that there is an understanding of here is what I'm assessing you on, but the other organization might actually interpret that in a completely different way. So it might be, it's hard. I think it's a problem and it's hard to address. I don't have the answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I suppose that zero trust risk assessment that Josh was referring to, you're then looking at third party risk assessments. I take it if they also use CrowdStrike and Zscaler, there are potential collaborations there, but within a supply chain.
I would add just being at one of those third parties that people would often think about in terms of having, you know, are we sure we want to share data with you? And the process that we see, generally we'll see a security assessment come in from a requesting party being a customer and say, and they're quite stringent. Chris, we get, you know, some of these take quite a fair bit of time. We have specific compliance teams that spend their whole time answering them. And I think in today's age where, you know, a breach can kind of hit anyone and everyone, the vendors are pretty, at least I can speak for Zscaler, are very, very vigilant about this and take it seriously in terms of their certifications, their requirements, and all the processes that go behind it. We have huge teams that are built just to do this. So I would say ask the questions. Don't just assume it's being done. And I think that's the key piece of zero trust is, you know, there's no implicit trust. You're not just implicitly trusting that we're going to do the right thing. Take us to task on it.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. There's plenty of, like, being in the space, in the security space, we have to go through continuous certification yearly, quarterly, and go through these assessments. There's multiple documentations. We, like, ASD is one thing, but, you know, ISO, compliance there, FISMA, there's a bunch of security certification that we go through, and we provide documentation of that to our customers to say, you know, what type of events or data are we collecting? Where do we keep them? Are they anonymized? Are they tokenized? Who's got access to that data? What sort of role-based access control do those internal users ask? As an architect, I don't have access to any customer information. I don't. It's a cardinal rule within CrowdStrike. We do not get access to it. It's the customer. They've got administrator access, and they define, based on that role-based access control, who gets access to the data and who do they share that with. So yeah, again, going back to that stringent certification documentation, we can provide that.
Very good.
And sorry, I've had a little bit more time to think. Potentially, I don't know if this would be possible, but leveraging a CASB type thing to do risk assessments, Mitch, and do some sort of a risk scoring it's not going to do the entire risk assessment. I think on top of that, you probably have to make sure that they're compliant with their, I don't know, ISO as an example, just so they're trying to adhere to best practices. But I was just thinking from the CASB perspective. I don't know. I'm having a think about that.
I mean, there's certainly most CASB products, including ours, we've got a number of criteria where you can set, you know, has this particular app had a breach that's been reported? Do they use good practices, etc.? I've also seen it can go either way, but I've seen a lot of platforms out there, and I can't name any off the top of my head, where they actually do a lot of this supply chain assessment for you, and you subscribe to this platform. And it can be painful for us sometimes, because generally a vendor needs to sign up and be part of that. And so there's a bit of fragmentation in the marketplace, but it could be something worth investigating.
Very good. Well, if there's no more questions, we've been going for about 40 minutes, and I think from a times perspective, that might be a good time to finish up. Now, we did know access control has always been a grappler for the community, and this is a very interesting integration between Zscaler and CrowdStrike, and obviously working with Sekuro there. There you anonymous. A question to all: how do you find the general adoption of Zero Trust in the market? Are there any industries that you're seeing adopting it more than others? What would you like to see change in regards to? We had a bit of a discussion around the perception of Zero Trust, but yeah, maybe some leading market segments that you're observing.
I'm not seeing a particular market in the lead there. I think there is enough interest from every organization we speak to and I speak to are all looking at Zero Trust. So it's gone beyond the buzzword, right? But I mean, the changes that I would like to see within Zero Trust is to remove the architecture from Zero Trust, because it just confuses everyone. It's confusing because of the perspective of our customers. The customers are getting completely mixed messages. Partners aren't sure exactly what's going on. Then we have to do our research, and then I think it's just a huge wheel of confusion.
Very good. Well, we did talk about pain points, and that's obviously sounds like the key pain points. Mitch, Sen, any final comments in terms of market segments that you're observing?
I think.
No, yeah, go, Mitch.
I think in general, we're just seeing people warm up to it more. Like Jason said, it's moved beyond the buzzword. It's moved into practicality, and whether people know it or not, there's a lot out there that are already doing aspects of Zero Trust, but without calling it that. So some people are on the journey, and it's just a matter of to realign the rest of that journey towards achieving a better security posture with it. So if I would like to see anything change in regards to it, I think, again, I'd still like the perception, no eye rolls, people take it a bit more seriously, because there is something that's actually tangible behind it now.
Very good. Well, Jason Trampevski, the CTO with Sekuro, Mitch Kelly, practice build consultant with Zscaler, and Sen Philip, security solutions architect ANZ for CrowdStrike. That could be a very interesting session. This session was recorded. It will be available on demand for a couple of weeks, and then it'll go onto our My Security TV channel. So you can definitely reach out more. So you'll get an email tomorrow with the edited version. So thank you very much to our panel. Thank you to Sekuro, Zscaler, and CrowdStrike. And thank you very much for attending. Have a great day.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.